Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
Thank you, Matt, for those kind remarks, and thank you. It's good to see folks out this evening to think about this subject. Will the real Jesus please stand up? I'm going to be speaking on the topic for the better part of an hour, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So as I talk, I want to invite you to be thinking about a question that you would like to raise, that you would like to discuss further, and then afterwards you'll have an opportunity to ask that question, and I'm anxious to hear from you on this topic. 20 centuries after his death, Jesus of Nazareth continues to fascinate the minds of thinking men and women. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code was for months the #1 bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list before being made into a blockbuster movie. Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ has now grossed some $640 million worldwide. Most recently, James Cameron, the director of the Titanic, has stirred the popular imagination by claiming to have discovered the family tomb of Jesus of Nazareth, including the very ossuary in which his bones lay. For centuries, Jesus of Nazareth has been the most influential person in the history of the human race, and he refuses to go away. But who was Jesus, really? Was he God incarnate, as Christians claim? Or was the historical Jesus, as many Jews believe, a typical Jewish holy man? Or are Muslims correct in thinking him to have been no more than a human prophet sent by God? Or could certain contemporary radical critics be right, that Jesus was a sort of social gadfly, the Jewish equivalent of a Greek cynic philosopher? Well, perhaps the best way to get a start at these questions is to ask what Jesus of Nazareth thought of himself. If you want to know who someone is, the logical place to start is to ask him who he thinks himself to be. Who did Jesus think that he was? Well, immediately we confront a problem. Since Jesus himself did not leave behind any writings of his own, we're dependent upon the records of others for knowing what Jesus said and did. Now, this situation isn't unusual for figures of antiquity. For example, the famous Greek philosopher Socrates also left behind no writings of his own. We're dependent upon his disciple, Plato, for most of our knowledge of Socrates' life and teaching. And in the same way, we're dependent upon the records of Jesus' followers for his life and teaching. But while this situation isn't unusual, it does occasion the question, how do we know that these records are accurate? Maybe Jesus' followers said that he said and did certain things, which he really didn't. In particular, since the early Christians believed that Jesus was God, maybe sayings and stories to that effect evolved and were ascribed to the historical Jesus. So we shouldn't be surprised that the Jesus we read about in the Gospels makes claims and does things implying his divinity. Maybe the historical Jesus who really lived was quite different from the divine figure that we read about in the Gospels. How can we tell if these records are historically accurate? Well, up until the modern era, questions like this were basically unanswerable. But with the rise during the Renaissance of modern historiography and the science of textual criticism, historical scholars began to develop the tools to unlock these questions. Today, Jesus of Nazareth is no longer just a figure in a stained glass window, but a real flesh and blood person of history, just like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, whose life can be investigated using the normal standards of historical investigation. The writings contained in the New Testament can be scrutinized using the same historical criteria that scholars use in investigating other sources of ancient history, like Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars or the Annals of Tacitus. Now, the first thing that we need to do in order to conduct a historical investigation of the life of Jesus is to assemble our sources. Jesus of Nazareth is referred to in a range of ancient sources, both inside and outside the New Testament, including Christian, Roman, and Jewish sources. Now, this fact is really quite extraordinary when you think about it. Jesus was a relatively obscure figure in ancient history. He had at most a 3-year public life as a Galilean preacher. We have far more information about Jesus of Nazareth than we do about many major figures of antiquity, which is really quite extraordinary given how obscure a figure Jesus of Nazareth was. The most important of these sources have been collected together into the book that today we call the New Testament. References to Jesus outside the New Testament tend to confirm what we read about Jesus in the Gospels, but they don't really tell us anything new. And therefore, the focus of our investigation must be upon the documents of the New Testament. Now, I find that many students don't understand this procedure. They think that if you examine the New Testament writings themselves, rather than look at sources outside the New Testament, then somehow you're reasoning in a circle, using the Bible to prove the Bible. If you even quote a passage from the New Testament, they think that you're somehow begging the question, presupposing that the New Testament is reliable. But that's not at all what historians are doing when they examine the New Testament records. They're not treating the Bible as a wholly inspired book and then trying to prove that it's true by quoting it. Rather, they're treating the New Testament like any other collection of ancient documents and investigating whether or not these documents are reliable in what they record. It's important in this connection to keep in mind that originally there wasn't any such book called the New Testament. There were just these separate documents handed down out of the first century. Things like the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John, the Acts of the Apostles, Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, Greece, and so forth. It wasn't until a couple of centuries later that the church collected these documents and put them under one cover, which today we call the New Testament. The church only included the earliest sources, which were closest to Jesus and the original disciples, and they left out the later secondary accounts like the forged Apocryphal Gospels, which everybody knew were fakes. So, from the very nature of the case, the best historical sources were included in the New Testament. People who insist on only looking at evidence drawn from sources outside the New Testament don't understand what they're asking us to do. They're demanding that we ignore the earliest primary sources about Jesus in favor of sources that are later, secondary, and less reliable, which is just mad as historical methodology. Now, this is important because all of the radical reinterpretations of the historical Jesus are based on later writings outside the New Testament. In particular, the so-called Apocryphal Gospels. Now, what are the Apocryphal Gospels? These are Gospels which were forged under the apostles' names. Things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, and so forth. They first began to appear in the second half of the 2nd century after Christ. Revisionists claim that it is these extra-biblical writings which are the key to correctly reconstructing the historical Jesus. Professor Luke Johnson, who is a distinguished New Testament scholar at Emory University, points out that the recent spate of books, all claiming to uncover the real Jesus, follow the same predictable 5-point pattern. It goes like this. Number 1, the book begins by trumpeting the scholarly credentials of the author and his prodigious research. Number 2, the author claims to offer some new and maybe even suppressed interpretation of who Jesus really was. 3, the truth about Jesus is said to be discovered by means of documents outside the New Testament, which enable us to read the Gospels in a new way which is at odds with their face value meaning. 4, this new interpretation is provocative, maybe even titillating. For example, that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, or was the leader of a hallucinogenic cult, or was a peasant cynic philosopher. And 5, it's implied that traditional Christian beliefs are therefore undermined and need to be revised. Now, if you hear of books following this familiar 5-point pattern, then your critical antennae should immediately go up. You are about to be duped. For the fact is that there is no historical source outside the New Testament which calls into question the portrait of Jesus painted in the Gospels. In the words of John Meyer, who is a prominent New Testament critic, the idea that the Apocryphal Gospels offer us new information about Jesus is, and I quote, largely fantasy. The fact is that these writings are later derivative writings shaped by the theology of the 2nd century after Christ and even later. Now, what this means in the words of Professor Johnson is that despite all of the hoopla, the writings of the New Testament remain our best historical witnesses to the life of Jesus. So, try not to think of the New Testament as a single book. Think of it as what it originally was. Just a bunch of separate documents in the Greek language coming down to us out of the 1st century, telling this remarkable story about Jesus of Nazareth. And the question must be, how historically reliable are these documents? Now here we confront the very crucial problem of the burden of proof. Should we assume that the Gospels are reliable unless they are proven to be unreliable? Or should we assume that the Gospels are unreliable unless they are proven to be reliable? Are they innocent until proven guilty? Or are they guilty until proven innocent? Skeptical scholars almost always assume that the Gospels are guilty until proven innocent. That is to say, they assume that the Gospels are unreliable unless and until they are proven to be accurate on some particular fact. And I'm not exaggerating here. This really is the approach of skeptical critics. I want to list, however, 5 reasons why I think it would be historically unjustified to assume that the Gospels are unreliable unless and until they are proven to be correct. Number 1, there was insufficient time for legendary influences to expunge the historical facts. Sometimes students will say, well, how can you know anything that happened 2,000 years ago? What they fail to understand is that the crucial time gap is not the gap between the evidence and today. Rather, what is important is the gap between the evidence and the events that the evidence is about. If the gap between the events and the evidence about those events is short, then it doesn't matter how much both the events and the evidence have receded into the past. Good evidence doesn't become poor evidence just because of the passage of time. So long as the time gap between the event and the evidence for that event is short, then it's just irrelevant how long ago the events have been till the present day. So the question then is, how close are the sources for Jesus' life to the events of Jesus' life? And I'll say something more about that in a minute. Number two, the Gospels are not analogous to folk tales or urban legends. Tales like those of Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill, or contemporary urban legends like the Vanishing Hitchhiker, rarely concern actual historical individuals and are therefore not analogous to the gospel narratives. 3, the Jewish transmission of sacred traditions was highly developed and reliable. In an oral culture like that of first century Palestine, the ability to memorize and retain large tracts of oral tradition was a highly prized and highly developed skill. From the earliest age, children in the home, in elementary school, and in the synagogue were taught to memorize faithfully sacred tradition. The disciples would have exercised similar care with respect to the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Number 4, there were significant restraints on the embellishment of traditions about Jesus, such as the presence of eyewitnesses and the apostles' supervision. Since those who had heard and seen Jesus continued to live, and the tradition about Jesus remained under the supervision of the apostles, these factors would act as a natural check on tendencies to elaborate the facts in a direction which would be contrary to that which was preserved by those who had known and walked with Jesus themselves. And finally, number 5, the gospel writers have a proven track record of historical reliability. Now, I don't have time to talk about all 5 of these points, but I want to say a word more about the first and the 5th points. So you remember that first point was that there was insufficient time for legendary influences to expunge the historical facts. You see, no modern scholar, or virtually no modern scholar, thinks of the Gospels as bald-faced lies, the result of a massive conspiracy. The only place that you find these sort of conspiracy theories is either in the popular press or in former propaganda from behind the Iron Curtain. When you read the pages of the New Testament, there is no doubt that these people sincerely believed the truth of the message that they proclaimed. Rather, ever since the 19th century, skeptical scholars have explained the Gospels as legends. They're not lies, rather they are the result of legendary influences. Like the child's game of telephone, as the stories about Jesus were passed on over the years and over the decades, they got muddled and exaggerated and mythologized until the original facts were all but lost. The Jewish peasant sage was transformed into the divine Son of God. Now, one of the major problems for the legend hypothesis, however, which is almost never addressed by skeptical critics, is that the time gap between Jesus' life and the writing of the Gospels is just too short for this to have happened. This point has been forcefully made by A.N. Sherwin-White in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. Professor Sherwin-White is not a theologian. Rather, he is a professional Greco-Roman historian, a historian of the era prior to and contemporaneous with the time of Jesus. According to Professor Sherwin-White, the sources for Roman and Greek history that he has to work with are usually biased, and usually removed 1 or 2 generations or even centuries from the events that they record. And yet, he says, historians reconstruct with confidence the course of Greek and Roman history. For example, the 2 earliest biographies that we have of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch over 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet, these accounts are treated as largely trustworthy records of the life of Alexander. The fabulous legends about Alexander the Great did not arise until during the centuries after these 2 writers. According to Sherwin-White, the writings of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus enable us to test the rate at which legend accumulates. And he says, the tests show that even 2 generations is too short a time span to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts. So when Professor Sherwin-White turns to the Gospels, he states that for the Gospels to be legends, the rate of legendary accumulation would have to be, and I quote, unbelievable. More generations would be needed. In fact, adding a time gap of 2 generations to the date of Jesus' death lands you in the 2nd century after Christ, at the time when the Apocryphal Gospels first do begin to appear. And these, in fact, do contain all sorts of legendary stories about Jesus, trying, for example, to fill in the missing years between his boyhood and the beginning of his ministry. And I think these are better candidates for the office of legendary fiction sought by the critics, not the biblical Gospels. This point becomes even more devastating for skepticism when we realize that the Gospels themselves use sources which go even farther back and are closer to the events of Jesus' life. For example, the story of Jesus' suffering and death, typically called the Passion story, was probably not originally written by Mark. Rather, Mark used a source for this narrative. Now, since Mark is already the earliest of the 4 Gospels, this means that his Passion source must be even earlier still. In fact, Rudolf Pesch, who is a German expert on Mark, says that the Passion source must go back to at least AD 37. That's just 7 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Or again, the Apostle Paul in his letters hands-on information concerning Jesus about his teaching, his Last Supper, his betrayal, his crucifixion, his burial, and his resurrection appearances. Paul's letters were written even before the Gospels, and some of his information, for example, what he passes on in his first letter to the church in Corinth about the resurrection appearances, has been dated to within 5 years after the crucifixion. It just becomes irresponsible to speak of legends in cases like these. The 5th point, you remember, was that the Gospel records have a proven track record of historical reliability. And again, I have time to only look at one example, Luke. Luke was the author of a 2-part work, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. These are separated in our New Testament only because the early church wanted to group the Gospels together, and so separated the book of Acts off from the Gospel of Luke. But they are really one work written by the same author. Luke is the Gospel writer who writes most self-consciously as a historian. In the preface to his work, he says the following: "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to set in order a narrative of those things which have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write for you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth of those things in which you have been instructed." Now, this preface is written in classical Greek, such as was used by the classical Greek historians. After this, Luke switches to a more vulgar Greek, a more common Greek. But in his preface, he has put his reader on alert that he can write, should he wish to, in the style of the learned Greek historian. And he speaks in this preface of his lengthy investigation of the story he's about to tell. He assures us that it is based on eyewitness testimony and is accordingly the truth. Now, who was this author that we call Luke? Well, he was clearly not himself an eyewitness to Jesus' life, because he said he depended upon the reports of eyewitnesses for his account of Jesus' life. But we discover an important fact about this author from the book of Acts. Beginning in the 16th chapter of the book of Acts, when Paul reaches Troas in modern-day Turkey, the author suddenly starts using the first-person plural. We set sail from Troas to Samothrace. We remained in Philippi for some days, as we were going to the place of prayer, and so on and so forth. The most obvious explanation of this sudden change is that the author had joined Paul's entourage in his evangelistic tour of the Mediterranean cities. And in chapter 21, he accompanies Paul back to Judea and finally to Jerusalem. What this means is that the author of Luke Acts was in fact in first-hand contact with the eyewitnesses to Jesus' life in Jerusalem. Now, skeptical critics have done backflips to try to avoid this conclusion. They say that the use of the first-person plural in the book of Acts shouldn't be taken literally. Rather, it was just a literary device which was common in ancient sea voyage stories. Never mind that many of the narratives of the book of Acts are not about Paul's sea voyage, but take place on land. The more important point is that this theory, when you check it out, turns out to be sheer fantasy. There just was no literary device in the ancient world of sea voyages told in the first-person plural. The whole thing has been shown to be a scholarly fiction. There's no avoiding the conclusion, I think, that Luke Acts was written by a traveling companion of Paul who had the opportunity to interview eyewitnesses to Jesus' life while in Jerusalem. Who were some of these eyewitnesses? Well, maybe we can get some clue by subtracting from the Gospel of Luke everything found in the other Gospels and seeing what remains that is peculiar to Luke alone. And when you do this, what you discover is that many of Luke's peculiar narratives are connected to women who followed Jesus during his ministry. People like Joanna and Susanna, and significantly, I think, Mary, Jesus' mother. Well, was the author reliable in getting his facts straight? The book of Acts enables us to answer that question decisively. You see, the book of Acts overlaps significantly with the secular history of the ancient world, and the historical accuracy of the book of Acts is indisputable. This has been recently demonstrated anew by Colin Hemer, who was a classicist who turned to New Testament studies late in his career, in his book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. Hemer goes through the book of Acts with a fine-toothed comb, pulling out a wealth of historical detail, ranging all the way from what would have been common knowledge to anyone in the ancient world, down to details so specific that only a local person would have been aware of them. And again, and again, and again, Luke's accuracy is demonstrated. From the sailings of the Alexandrian corn fleet out of Egypt, to the coastal terrain of the Mediterranean islands, to the peculiar and shifting titles of the local officials, Luke gets it right. According to Professor Sherwin White, and I quote, "The confirmation of historicity in Acts is overwhelming, any attempt to reject its historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. The judgment of Sir William Ramsay, a world-famous archaeologist, still stands. He said, "Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed among the very greatest of historians." Given Luke's accuracy and demonstrated reliability, as well as his contact with eyewitnesses within the first generation after the events, this author is trustworthy. So on the basis of those 5 reasons that I listed, I think that we ought to treat the Gospels as reliable unless and until they are proven to be unreliable on some specific point. But in any case, at the very least, I think, we cannot assume that they are unreliable unless and until they are proven to be right. We should at least adopt a position of neutrality as we approach these documents. Now, by the very nature of the case, it will be impossible to say a whole lot more beyond this point to prove that certain stories in the Gospels are historically true. How could you prove, for example, the story of Jesus' visiting Mary and Martha in Bethany? We just have here a story told by a reliable author in a position to know, and no good reason to doubt the historicity of the account. There's not a whole lot more to say. Nevertheless, for many of the key aspects of Jesus' life, a great deal more can be said. And what I'd like to do now is to take just some of the most important aspects of Jesus in the Gospels and say a word about their historical credibility. Number 1, Jesus' radical self-concept. Jesus' radical self-concept. Radical critics deny that the historical Jesus thought of himself as the Messiah or the Son of God or anybody particularly special. They say that after Jesus' death, the early church claimed that he had said these things, even though he really didn't. The fundamental problem with this hypothesis is that it remains inexplicable how monotheistic Jews could have attributed divinity to a man they had known and accompanied during his life if he had never claimed any such things about himself. Monotheism lay at the very heart of the Jewish religion, and it would have been blasphemous to say that a human being was God. And yet this is precisely what the earliest Christians did believe and proclaim about Jesus of Nazareth. Such a claim must have been rooted somehow in Jesus' own teaching. And in fact, the majority of scholars do believe that among the historically authentic words of Jesus are claims that reveal his divine self-understanding. Now, I could give a whole talk on this subject alone, but let me just focus upon Jesus' self-concept of being the unique Son of God and the Son of Man. Jesus' radical self-understanding as God's only Son comes to expression in his parable of the wicked tenants of the vineyard, found in Mark chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. Even skeptical scholars admit the authenticity of this parable. And let me simply read it to you before commenting on it. He began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, dug a place for the wine vat, and built a tower. Then he leased it out to vine dressers and went into a far country. Now at vintage time, he sent a servant to the vine dressers that he might receive some of the fruit of the vineyard from the vine dressers. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again he sent them another servant, and at him they threw stones and wounded him in the head and sent him away shamefully treated. And again he sent another, and him they killed, and many others, beating some and killing some. Therefore, still having one son, his beloved, he also sent him to them, saying last, they will respect my son. But those vine dressers said to themselves, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him and cast him out of the vineyard. Now, in this parable, the owner of the vineyard represents God. The vineyard symbolizes Israel. The vine dressers or the tenants are the Jewish religious leaders of Jesus' day, and the servants sent by the owner are the prophets sent by God to Israel. The tenants beat and reject the owner's servants, killing some of them, beating others. Finally, the owner of the vineyard says, I have one left to send, my only beloved son. They will listen to my son. But instead, the tenants kill the son because he is the heir to the vineyard. Now, what does this parable tell us about Jesus' self-consciousness? It tells us that he thought of himself as God's only beloved son, distinct from all the prophets who had gone before, God's final messenger, and even the heir to Israel itself. This is no mere peasant Jewish cynic. Jesus' self-concept as God's chosen one, as the Son of Man, also comes to expression in the Gospels in his trial scene. Now, before I look at that passage, we need to say a word about this expression, the Son of Man. Most people probably think that the title, the Son of Man, refers to Jesus' humanity, just as the title, the Son of God, refers to his divinity. In fact, almost the opposite is true. The Son of Man is an expression that comes from the 7th chapter of the prophecy of Daniel, where Daniel has a vision in which he sees a divine human figure coming on the clouds of heaven. This is how Daniel describes it in chapter 7, verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall never be destroyed. Now, in his trial, Jesus is asked by the high priest to identify himself as to his identity. In Mark chapter 14 and verse 60, we read, the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, do you answer nothing? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying, are you the Christ? That is to say, the Messiah. Christ is the Greek word for Messiah. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? That is the Son of God. Jesus said, I am. And then in a virtual quotation from Daniel 7, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes and said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Here Jesus claims to be not only the Messiah, the Son of God, but also the Son of Man, prophesied by Daniel, to whom all judgment and dominion and kingdom would be given. And especially blasphemous to Jewish ears would be his claim to be seated at the right hand of God himself. This is really incredible stuff. And yet this is what the historical Jesus believed about himself. And this is only one facet of Jesus' radical self-understanding. C.S. Lewis was right when he said a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. Lewis said, you must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us, end quote. Number 2, Jesus' miracles. Even the most skeptical critics today do not deny that the historical Jesus carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. Rudolf Bultmann, who was one of the most radical, skeptical scholars of the 20th century, wrote back in 1926 the following: "Most of the miracle stories contained in the Gospels are legendary, or at least are dressed up with legends. But, Bultmann says, there can be no doubt that Jesus did such deeds, which were, in his and his contemporaries' understanding, miracles. That is, deeds that were the result of supernatural, divine causality. Doubtless, he healed the sick and cast out demons." That from one of the most skeptical New Testament critics of the 20th century. Back in Bultmann's day, the miracle stories were thought to have been influenced by stories of mythological heroes in pagan mythology, and hence at least in part legendary. But today it is recognized that the hypothesis of mythological influence was simply historically incorrect. Craig Evans, who is a well-known Jesus scholar, says that the older notion that the miracle stories were the product of mythological divine man ideas has, and I quote, been largely abandoned. He says it is no longer seriously contested that miracles played a role in Jesus' ministry. The only reason left for denying that Jesus of Nazareth performed literal miracles would be the presupposition of anti-supernaturalism or naturalism. And that is not a historical consideration. That is a philosophical position which is independent of the evidence. Number 3, Jesus' trial and crucifixion. According to the Gospels, Jesus was condemned by the Jewish high court, as we've read, on the charge of blasphemy. And then he was delivered over to the Romans for execution for the treasonous act of setting himself up as the king of the Jews. These facts are not only confirmed by independent biblical sources, like the writings of Paul or the Acts of the Apostles, but they are also confirmed by extra-biblical sources. For example, from the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus, we learn that Jesus was crucified by Roman authority under the sentence of Pontius Pilate. From Josephus and the Syrian writer Marabar Serapion, we learn that the Jewish leaders made a formal accusation against Jesus and participated in the events leading up to his crucifixion. And from the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, we learn that Jewish involvement in the trial was explained as a proper undertaking taken against a heretic. According to Luke Johnson, the support for the mode of his death, its agents, and perhaps its co-agents, is overwhelming. Jesus faced a trial before his death, was condemned, and executed by crucifixion. The crucifixion of Jesus is recognized even by radical critics as, in the words of Robert Funk, the chairman of the so-called Jesus Seminar, as the one indisputable fact about Jesus of Nazareth. But that raises a very puzzling question. Why was Jesus crucified? As we've seen, the evidence indicates that his crucifixion was instigated by his blasphemous claims, which would come across to Roman ears as treasonous. That's why he was crucified, in the words of the plaque that was nailed to the cross above his head, as the King of the Jews. But, you see, if Jesus was just a peasant, cynic philosopher, just a liberal social gadfly on the collective rump of Jewish society, then his crucifixion becomes inexplicable. As Professor Leander Keck of Yale University has written, the idea that this Jewish cynic and his dozen hippies, with his demeanor and aphorisms, was a serious threat to society sounds more like a conceit of alienated academics than sound historical judgment. John Mayer is equally direct. He says, such a Jesus would threaten no one, just as the university professors who create him threaten no one. The skeptical critics have thus created a Jesus who is incompatible with the one indisputable fact about Jesus, namely his crucifixion. Finally, number 4, Jesus' resurrection. Most people think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But in fact, there are 4 established facts which are recognized today by the majority of New Testament critics who have written on the subject, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to emphasize that I'm not talking here about conservative scholars. I'm talking about the broad mainstream of New Testament scholarship today. Fact number 1, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish high court that had condemned him to death, buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Now, this fact is highly significant because it means that the site of Jesus' grave was known to both Jew and Christian alike in Jerusalem. In that case, it becomes inexplicable how a movement founded on the belief in his resurrection could arise and flourish in Jerusalem in the face of a tomb containing his corpse. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the honorable burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. Fact number 2, on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, the tomb of Jesus was found empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, who is an Austrian specialist in the resurrection, and I quote, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb, end quote. As D.H. Van Dalen points out, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. He says those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Fact number 3, on multiple occasions and under a variety of circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This is a fact that is virtually universally acknowledged among New Testament scholars today. Even Gerhard Ludemann, perhaps the most prominent current critic of the resurrection, admits, and I quote, it may be taken as historically certain, those are his words, not mine, as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ, end quote. Finally, fact number 4, the original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Despite having every predisposition to the contrary, it is an undeniable fact of history that the original disciples believed in, proclaimed, and were willing to go to their deaths for the fact of Jesus' resurrection. C.F.D. Moll of Cambridge University concludes that we have here a belief which nothing in terms of prior historical influences can account for, apart from the resurrection itself. Any responsible historian, then, who wants to give an account of the fate of Jesus of Nazareth must deal with these 4 independently established facts: the honorable burial of Jesus, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And again, I want to emphasize that these facts represent not the conclusions of conservative scholars, but rather the majority view of New Testament scholarship on Jesus of Nazareth today. The question is then, how do you best explain these facts? Well, here the skeptical critic faces a somewhat awkward position. For example, several years ago, I had a debate at the University of California, Irvine, with a professor on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, this man had written his doctoral dissertation on the evidence for the resurrection, and he was thoroughly familiar with the evidence. He could not deny the facts of Jesus' honorable burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, or the origin of the Christian faith. He acknowledged them all. And therefore, his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of these four facts. And so, he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him at birth, who grew up independently, unbeknownst to anybody else, who came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole Jesus' body out of the tomb, and presented himself to the disciples, who mistakenly inferred that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into how I went about refuting this theory, but I think that the example is instructive because it shows to what desperate lengths skepticism must go in order to explain away the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, the evidence is so powerful that one of the world's leading Jewish theologians, the late Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Tel Aviv, declared himself convinced on the basis of the evidence that the God of Israel raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. In summary, then, the Gospels are not only trustworthy documents in general, but as we look at some of the more specific and important aspects of Jesus' life, such as his radical personal claims, his miracles, his trial and crucifixion, and his resurrection, their historical veracity shines through. God has acted in history, and we can know it.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.